Jacksonville, Florida. May 1969. The show was over. Jimi Hendrix had been playing for nearly 2 hours, and the crowd had been on its feet for most of it. The kind of show where people forget to blink, where the guitar does something you didn't think a guitar could do, and then does it again, differently, and you realize you've been holding your breath for the last 10 minutes without knowing it. Now the stage was being broken down. The audience was gone. And backstage, in a narrow concrete room that smelled like cigarette smoke and dried sweat, Jimi was sitting alone with a towel across his shoulders, not talking to anyone. He wasn't being difficult, he just didn't need anyone right now. There were people in the hallway. There were always people in the hallway after a show. Managers, hangers-on, someone's cousin, someone's girlfriend, a journalist who had a press pass from 6 months ago and was still using it. The door was half open. Nobody had the nerve to walk in. Nobody except the kid from Jacksonville. Ronnie Van Zant was 20 years old. He wasn't famous. Nobody at that venue knew his name, and that was a fact he carried with him everywhere he went. The way some men carry a chip and some men carry a wound. Quietly, but always there. He'd gotten backstage the way young musicians sometimes did, by knowing someone who knew someone, by being persistent, by looking like he belonged even when he didn't. He was tall, lean, with a certainty about him that wasn't arrogance exactly. More like a very specific kind of conviction. The kind that comes from being raised to believe that where you're from means something, that it counts. He'd been watching Jimi play from the side of the stage all night, and something about it had been bothering him. He couldn't name it at first. The playing was undeniable. Van Zant wasn't stupid. He knew what he was watching. But there was something about the distance of it, the complexity, the way the music kept moving away from you just as you thought you grabbed it. Van Zant's music, the music he was trying to build with his band, still unnamed, still playing small clubs on the south side of town, was the opposite of that. 3 chords. Direct. Say what you mean. Say it loud. Go home. He believed in that. Deeply. So he walked through the half-open door. Jimi looked up. Not startled, just looked. "You played tonight," Van Zant said. It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't a question either. "Yeah," Jimi said. Van Zant stayed near the door. He didn't sit down. There was a wooden crate next to Jimi's chair and an empty folding table pushed against the wall. Somebody had left a half-empty bottle of Coke on it, sweating in the heat. The room was lit by a single overhead bulb that buzzed slightly, the way cheap bulbs do in old buildings when the wiring is older than everyone in the room. Jimi's Stratocaster was leaning against the wall in the corner, out of its case, unplugged, just resting. "I play too," Van Zant said. Jimi pulled the towel off his shoulders and set it on the table. Didn't respond. "I've been trying to figure something out." Van Zant's voice was steady. He decided not to be nervous. "You play a lot of notes. All that," he gestured vaguely toward the stage, the general direction of what had just happened out there. "People can't always follow it. They get lost in it." Jimi watched him. "Real music," Van Zant said. And here's something shifted in his voice, some edge that was part conviction, part something he hadn't fully sorted out yet. "Should be simple. 3 chords, something people can feel without having to understand it first." He let that sit for a moment. "What do you do with 3 chords?" It came out a little harder than he meant it to. Not a question, really. More like a dare dressed as a question, the kind you offer when you already think you know the answer. Jimi didn't respond. He sat there for a moment, not thinking about what to say, it seemed, but just letting the question land. Then he reached over, without getting up, and lifted the Stratocaster from where it was leaning against the wall. He set it across his lap. No amp, no cable, nothing. Just the guitar. He brought his left hand up to the neck slowly. His thumb found the back of the neck. His fingers settled on the strings. Not a chord, not yet. Just a position. Resting there, like he was getting reacquainted with something familiar. Van Zant watched. Jimi plucked a single open string, let it ring. Then he adjusted the tuning slightly, turned a peg a fraction, plucked again, listened. The string had already been in tune. He'd adjusted it anyway, the way you might clear your throat before speaking. Not from necessity, from something else. Then he started playing. It was 3 chords. That's the thing about what happened next. And this is the part Van Zant would turn over in his mind for years afterward. He'd asked for 3 chords, and that is exactly what he got. No tricks, no sleight of hand, no way to say later that Jimi had cheated the question. But the sound that came out of that unplugged Stratocaster in that concrete room, quiet, dry, resonant, buzzing slightly with the wood, was not what Van Zant had been expecting. It was Delta blues, old blues, the bones of something that had been traveling north and south and sideways through American music for 40 years before either of them was born. Robert Johnson, Skip James, played the way it was always meant to be played, without electricity, without amplification, without anything at all between the player and the air in the room. Jimi moved through the 3 chords slowly, deliberately. He let each chord ring out and decay before moving to the next. And in that space, in the gap between the chords, in the silence that filled the room before the next note arrived, Van Zant heard something he hadn't heard before. Not notes, not technique, space. The kind of space that isn't empty, the kind that holds weight. Van Zant's eyes dropped to Jimi's hands. He hadn't decided to look. They just went there on their own. He watched the left hand, the way the pressure on the strings changed between notes, the way the thumb moved quietly along the back of the neck, the pauses that were too deliberate to be pauses, too full to be silence. He wasn't playing a song exactly. He was playing a conversation with himself, and the 3 chords were just the words. It lasted maybe 2 minutes, maybe less. When Jimi stopped, he didn't end it like a performance ends. He just let the last chord go. Didn't lift his hand, didn't look up. Just let the note travel where it was going, until there was nothing left but the buzz of that overhead bulb. Van Zant didn't speak. He was standing in the same place he'd been the whole time, near the door, weight on one foot, his hand still partly raised from when he gestured earlier. He hadn't moved. He'd barely breathed, he realized. The back of his throat felt dry. Something had happened that he wasn't ready to name. He'd come in here to make a point, and in a way the point had been made, just not the one he'd intended. Jimi had played 3 chords. Simple, direct, no effects, no fire, no theater, just wood and strings and 2 hands in a room with a buzzing light bulb. And it had been more. That was the thing Van Zant was standing with. Not that Jimi was better. He'd known that walking in, he wasn't a fool. But that simplicity, the very thing Van Zant had claimed as his own territory, as the South's territory, as the honest man's way of playing music. Jimi had just walked right into it and played it like he'd always lived there. Like he'd been born inside of it. The worst part was that Jimi hadn't seemed to be trying. That was the thing that cut. He hadn't leaned forward or closed his eyes dramatically. He just sat there and played 3 chords on an unplugged guitar in a fluorescent concrete room, the way you'd hum to yourself in the shower. And it had been more than anything Van Zant had played on a real stage with a real amp in front of a real crowd. Van Zant turned toward the door, stopped, looked back. "Where'd you learn that?" His voice was quieter than before. Jimi looked up. "Learn what?" "The space. Between the notes." A short silence. The kind that isn't uncomfortable. Just honest. "Everybody plays the notes," Jimi said. "I just listen to what's in between them." Van Zant stood there for another second. Then he nodded. Not at Jimi, really, more to himself, and walked out. He didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything left to say. He didn't tell anyone what happened in that room. Not that night, not for a long time. His band kept playing Jacksonville. Kept playing the small clubs, the bar gigs, the shows where half the crowd was there for cheap beer and the other half wasn't paying attention. Ronnie Van Zant was good at that kind of persistence. Building something slow, from the ground up, from 3 chords, and a voice that sounded like the South actually sounded. Not the South people outside the South imagined. They named themselves Lynyrd Skynyrd. They recorded. They became something real. Jimi Hendrix died in September 1970. Van Zant heard it on the radio, sitting in a car in a parking lot in Jacksonville, on his way somewhere he no longer remembers. He didn't say anything. Just sat there for a while. He didn't talk publicly about the backstage room for years. But in the spring of 1976, Lynyrd Skynyrd, by then one of the biggest rock bands in the country, Sweet Home Alabama on every radio station, the name on every marquee. Van Zant sat down with a music journalist and was asked about influences. Not the obvious ones, the real ones. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means someone is deciding how much to say. "There was one time," he said finally, "I walked into a room and asked Jimi Hendrix to play something simple. 3 chords, no amp, nothing. He picked up an unplugged guitar and played old Delta blues in a concrete room. And he paused, looked at his hands. "I didn't say anything. I just left." The journalist asked if it had changed how he played. Van Zant thought about it, really thought about it, for longer than most people take to answer a question in an interview. "Simple man," he said. "When I was writing that song, I kept thinking about space, about what to leave out, about how the thing you don't play says more than the thing you do sometimes." He shook his head slightly. "I don't know if I would have understood that the same way. Without that night." He never said Jimmy taught him anything. That's important. He would have pushed back hard against that word. Van Zant learned from the South, from his father, from the particular kind of hardness that Jacksonville gave to the people who grew up there. That was his story, and he wasn't wrong about it. But something entered the room with him when he walked in that night, and something different walked out. Jimmy hadn't made a point, hadn't proven anything, hadn't even really answered the challenge as a challenge. He just picked up the guitar and played, the way breathing is to most people. Not a choice, just what happens. 3 chords, an unplugged guitar, a single overhead bulb in a concrete room in Jacksonville, Florida, on a warm night in May, and a 20-year-old kid standing near the door, learning something about simplicity from the most complicated guitarist alive, without a single word being spoken about it.